Today I want to take a few moments to lay out another spiritual discipline that I think is crucial for a rule of life in the midst of isolation. And that discipline is solitude. Now I know what you're thinking. Now is not the time I need more solitude. I've got plenty of solitude and could honestly use a little less. But solitude is not the same thing as being alone. If we are alone for long stretches of time, one of two things will happen. One outcome is that we'll not just be alone, but we'll be lonely. Different people reach this place of loneliness at different rates and in different ways. Some of us feel that loneliness even when we're surrounded by others because we feel still not truly known in the midst of their presence. But since we were all made for some measure, some level of community, we will all eventually get to this place of loneliness when we are isolated. Often when we start to feel that loneliness, though, we try to fend it off with screens or numb it by some other form of distraction. Facebook or YouTube are excellent examples. But loneliness is not the only potential outcome of being alone. The other is what the Christian tradition has often called solitude. Solitude is the experience of being alone with God. Solitude is the practice of intentionally shutting off social engagement, intentionally turning off the screens and entertainment that would numb that loneliness, and in the midst of that loneliness, turning our attention to the presence of God, who is always with us. Because in that kind of solitude, we learn that we are never truly alone. We learn that we don't have to be stimulated to be emotionally okay. We learn that we don't always have to live in reference to what other people think of us. We learn to hear our deepest identity beyond the identities that others place on us. And we learn that everything actually revolves around this unseen God who sits below everything else that happens to us. But those discoveries in solitude often come with wrestling, often come by pressing through the fear of what we're going to find if we turn off the noise. Bonhoeffer said that we are so afraid of silence that we chase ourselves from one event to the next in order not to have to spend a moment alone with ourselves, in order not to have to look ourselves in the mirror. These last 2 weeks obviously have been crazy for me and many others, but the turning point in my own experience of this crisis was the middle of last week when I got to go on a 24-hour silent retreat. I go once a quarter, and the timing of this retreat seemed to be terrible. And it turned out to be perfect because in the midst of all the voices, including my own saying, this is what we should do, this is what we should do, this is how we should go, I needed to get away and listen for the voice of God in the midst of the noise. I needed to hear His voice saying who He is and who I am. It was transformative. But if you choose to receive this invitation to press into this solitude, you should know that loneliness and solitude are not mutually exclusive realities. They're like a Venn diagram that can overlap. We can be in solitude with God and yet still lonely for human interaction. In this age, before we see God face to face and our neighbors in their glorified perfection, no form of communion is going to be complete. We're going to feel both presence and absence, fullness and emptiness mixed together, and that's okay. The fullness we long for is still on its way, but as we are on the way, if we learn to wrestle in these places of solitude, the healing the world so desperately needs and longs for, that we so desperately need and long for, can be birthed in here. Blaise Pascal said that all of humanity's problems stem from our inability to sit quietly in a room alone. Now maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but But if we learn to sit in that room alone, if we learn to rest both in the joy of presence and that ache of absence, we're going to be a lot closer to healing than if we turn on the TV. You see, God has often called his servants into isolation, into the wilderness to reveal himself. And I wonder if maybe that's part of the invitation to us in these days.